history of hand destruction in One Piece TCG. Hand destruction has always been an interesting thing in a lot of card games. In card games, people love to just disrupt your opponent's hand and honestly frustrate your opponent, and it can lead to some of the most hilarious outcomes when it comes to these sort of things. And it just kind of depends on what's going on. A lot of it's hand disruption, or it is destruction in a way where it's either random. And in One Piece, this game's been out for about 2 years now, and in that time there's only been a handful of cards in all of the sets. I'm going to go through every single set and all the cards and the most impactful cards of today. For those of you that actually don't play One Piece and have no idea on the mechanics of it, one card does equal quite a bit. There is not a lot of cards in the game that actually draw you cards, and having a hand size of something like 9 or 10 cards is actually quite rare unless you're playing a specific deck or maybe against a specific matchup. Most decks have their hand around 5, 6, 7, 8 cards. Essentially, most cards will have something like a counter value on the side, so you can always discard them to defend yourself against your opponent's attacks. But there is a lot of leeway in this action. As well as this, I'm using the deck builder from eggmanevents.com. Go to eggmanevents.com with the deck builder to look and read through cards yourself. I 100% want to promote specifically Eggman Events, thanking Eggman and his colleagues for having such an awesome platform. Without further ado, let's get into the goo. So, in the beginning, there was just trial decks for the first few months of the set, and actually there were no hand destruction cards, nothing of disruption of any sort. There was field disruption, kind of like with Doflamingo, where essentially you can return one of your opponent's characters to their hand, or maybe field control, but nothing of hand destruction of sort. In OP01, right out of the gate, there actually was hand destruction, and a lot of it was pretty bad. It was used in a lot of sorts, and there were 3 main cards, but I first wanted to go over the main deck that liked to use them and was very popularized from one of the first case tournaments from PPG. With Crocodile, it was a very stalling out leader, and it was the first inkling of an actual hand destruction deck where people actually played the hand destruction way with this. There were, in fact, better decks going forward into this set. However, this was one of the more funner ones where people would play one of these 2 cards. The more popular one was X-Drake. This was played in all purple decks because it did also have the 2K counter on the side, but its skill was just on play, Dawn -1. Your opponent trashes 1 card from their hand. Your opponent does get to choose, but over time, you can actually solidify a win, especially when your opponent only has 1 or 2 or 3 cards in hand. If you played this down and your opponent had like 6 or 7 cards in hand, they just discard their worst card, and it really wasn't that big of a deal. And then next was actually Jack. The problem with Jack is he was such a small body, and he was easily removed after the first time he swang. And he had a very big cost, which is when attacking Dawn -1, your opponent trashes 1 card from their hand. It was honestly kind of counterproductive for the main deck of purple, because you just kind of want to swing too big, so it doesn't really matter how many cards they have in their hand. But in other decks like that Crocodile, it was a long-term gameplay where you swung with Jack every turn and hopefully defended out Jack, so you're able to jack them up many times. In OP02, we actually did not get a single hand destruction card. However, in the trial deck, they did have a trigger card where you can hit Great Eruption, your opponent trashes 1 card from their hand. This card was later banned for other reasons, not because of the trigger, but because the draw 1 -2 effect, which we kind of already still have a good card that does something similar. But without further ado, really, there really wasn't anything big as far as hand destruction goes in this set at all. In OP03, this is where things really heated up with hand destruction, but I did want to go over a little bit of the meta at that time. First, I want to say Soap Sheep. It did just have a trigger of the same kind. This card was not used at all in any way. It is being slightly used today, but in more niche cringe cases. And the big card is Isho, which is on play if your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand, trash 2 cards from your opponent's hand. And it's a really interesting thing because this is the first card that invited random play, because you trash the cards from your hand. You get to choose the card and they must trash it. So the big problem with this card is that it was an 8 cost, and in the time in the meta where it was mainly Zoro in a lot of other few decks, this also did good into Whitebeard, right? But it was mostly Zoro, Law, Blue Doflamingo, and maybe other few Stringe decks. You could actually play around this leader and just have 5 cards in hand. These days, it's almost impossible to have 5 or less cards in hand, and it's just difficult in that regard. But as far as Isho goes, he's actually going to be a long-standing card in more slower metas, and actually is a big pivotal point in today's meta. In OP04, we actually had 0 cards come out during this set in order to have any sort of minus effect from your opponent's hand, and as far as disruption goes. And then actually the main thing is, I'm going into OP05 now, but I do want to bring up the trial deck that came out for the 3 captains, and it probably brought in one of the better cards as far as hand destruction goes. And it had the same effect as Isho, but you have to have 7 or less cards. But this card had a lot of effects. So first of all, it was a blocker. It was a 4 cost. So you can play it on the earlier turn. And Dawn -1, if your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, you may trash 2 cards from their hand. So it would trash 2 random cards. It only cost them a Dawn -1, and it would just end up being a blocker. So one of the better cards as far as things go, but it's a lot easier to play around having 7 cards in hand. At the same time, purple had a kind of a negative drawback. You kind of didn't want to Dawn minus too much early because you wanted to get to your big end cards, and you didn't really want to play this down too early. Now with red purple law gone, its cards probably not going to see as much play in regards. But when red purple law was at its height, this card was honestly peak and really dictated most games. It's kind of good justice though, because red purple law would never have 7 cards in hand, so you never red purple or purple law a red purple law. But against any other deck, this is a pretty good card into most matchups. OP06. OP06 did a lot of floodgating for this entire game, where they had a lot more discard cards, and we're going to go over all those right now. First of all, they had Perona. Perona, if you have 5 or more cards in their hand, so that if they have that, it's a condition. Perona is a 2k counter, but you can give a character -3, or your opponent discards 1 card from their hand. And this card was played out very easily with the Gecko Maria leader. And with Gecko Maria really just, calling this out, it would end up being the first card they call out. And you can do this multiple times. It would be really frustrating for most opponents playing against this. They also have Negative Hollow. Negative Hollow wasn't really used at all, but it is being seen use right now today in Gecko Moria decks because of cards like Hogback that can actually pull back a card, including any really card from the trash that is a Thriller Bark Pirate. So you might see this coming up. I will say I have lost this card coming at a trigger, and I ran out of cards in hand to essentially just lose the game. But this card, it does exist, just so you guys know. And then the penultimate of the most toxic cards, and kind of half the reason I'm even making this video, is Charlotte Pudding. A lot of people have this on their maps to ban or limit this card, because in every blue deck, they play this. If you're playing a blue deck that is not Nami, and even in some cases, some Namis play this deck, it's just so powerful. So let's go into the skill. First of all, I will say it's a 1k counter, so it always has that flexibility. And on play, your opponent returns all of the cards in their hand to the deck and shuffles their deck, and then they redraw 5 cards. So it doesn't matter. There is no other condition. If your opponent has too many cards in hand, 6 cards, even 5 cards, and remixing their hand because they may have sculpted their hand to be better, they just get a whole random new 5 cards. This is a very detrimental card here because essentially it will hit cards or decks that have 7, 8, 9, 10 cards in hand. And you just have to kind of play around this card the whole entire time, which really can be difficult against some blue decks. Some blue decks are very aggressive, and so you have to take damage early, and then they have a waiting turn where they're just played out in this pudding. And I hope this card finds itself maybe sort of a refit. Maybe they ban this card and make this card a little bit different, maybe add a condition to it, maybe make it a little bit more powerful as far as the base goes. But I guess the only thing this card really has is that it's not searchable in most capacities unless it's a weird, strange deck. In the EBO1 and like a trial deck for the green-blue Sanji deck, there really wasn't anything that was adding to this entire hand destruction effect. And then finally, we're kind of at the last two parts. In OPO7, we did get 2 cards. I will say this card's a hand disruption. I wanted to include it, but really, this card's just a joke. You're not going to be play this. On play, your opponent discards 1 card from their hand and then reveals their entire hand. Then your opponent draws a card. So kind of an interesting thing if you want to see what your opponent's going on, but like, why would you ever pay 2 for this in any black deck? And then finally, Trafalgar Law. Trafalgar Law is an interesting card in blue. The main fact is it is conditional, but he is a 2k counter. So it's a 4/4. It's usually not going to be attacking, and you can just return it to your hand. And essentially, if your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand, they place 1 card from their hand at the bottom of their deck. So it was a little bit of hand disruption, but it requires them to have 6 or more cards in hand. The main use of this was that you can actually just put this card back in your hand because you call this on the field through some other way by using your leader skill with Doflamingo or maybe using some other effects. But the fact that it's a 2k and a 7 Warlord is why this card's being played at all. The alt art is pretty sweet for this deck, so it will be seen more. But the main thing is that it's a slight hand disruption going forward. And with OPO8, I actually don't see a single card that has any hand disruption. The main takeaways I want to take from this is that hand disruption is always going to be a big key factor in a lot of these metas now. And I find that Isho, Law, and Pudding are going to be essentially the biggest cards. You could say Perona and Negative Hollow might actually have some inklings, but if you see a blue deck, you definitely need to play around Pudding the entire time. And then if you see a purple deck, well, they may run Law. You could guess around with that. The Dawn Minus may affect them too hard. And then, of course, Isho is impossible to play around. You have to actually just go aggressive against any black deck these days, because if they play down an Isho and you have 6 or more cards in hand, they have that 9k body. You may have no way to get rid of it. And this, just this 8 cost 9k body alone is already pretty powerful. His other secondary skill of minusing 3 to people's cost by just putting a Dawn under it's very good. But this on play is just so disgusting. And if you don't go aggro on your opponent's decks, they're able to just kind of get away and play this, and then it's just going to be a sitting monster for the rest of the game. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. I appreciate you all watching the video. I first want to say, if you're liking the video, make sure you guys leave a like. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And thank you all to all my patrons for being a patron. You're supporting what I do. If you want to see some good upcoming guides coming out on my Patreon, just join the Discord, see what's going on, and we'll see you all in the next video. Ciao.